to our anti-KKK rally. Thank you for staying with us through the rain, through the heat, through the mugginess, through the humidity, to take a stand against the Klan. So, as I'm sure everybody knows, the Klan has been skulking around Mobile, Alabama and the surrounding areas again, poking their heads out of their caves to leave flyers on people's doorsteps, bashing the transgender and LGBTQ community on top of their regular bigotry toward people of color and people of non-Christian religions. But we are here to tell them to go back to the 19th century where they belong. Woo! Woo! So we've got some great speakers today. My name is Tyler Henderson. I'm an organizer with Mobile-based Socialist Alternative. We're the group that put this together today. Although we didn't do it alone, we did it with the help and support of the entire community. So first up, we have an activist from Florida, Delia, who is a trans activist and a YouTube partner. She's an organizer with the transgender advocacy group, Strive. She's a freelance writer who's been featured in Everyday Feminism and the Huffington Post. So as not to take up any more time, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Delia.
Thank you. Recently, pamphlets have surfaced in Dothan, and as I've been informed, have been surfacing in other areas of Lower Alabama and Northwest Florida as well, carrying a clear message of hatred, discrimination, and violence aimed at the transgender community, my community. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with those flyers, and are also well aware that they bear the mark of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization which is likely best known for its long-established history of promoting white supremacy, but which is also an organization with a long-established history of promoting misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and religious fundamentalism. It is also perhaps, unsurprisingly, an organization to which our nation has granted an unsettling level of tolerance, some may even argue hidden support, for the entire span of its existence. As a transgender woman, I find these pamphlets very unsettling. As a transgender person of color, I find any KKK activity to be unsettling. But there are many who are not unsettled. When presented with these flyers, Dothan Police Captain Will Benny said it is a free speech issue. There is no threat put in there, no call to arms. It looks like they are asking for donations and putting out a political agenda instead of a hate-based one. As a transgender woman, I cannot help but disagree. Yet many times, people who are not trans will not see it that way, even with the stamp of the KKK attached to the message. Why? Because oftentimes, people who are not trans do not recognize trans women as real women, much less acknowledge the existence of transgender men who were designated female at birth, or the existence of non-binary transgender people who do not fall subject to the Western gender binary at all, and moreover, they do not recognize any of us as real human beings. Now, I'm well aware that not everyone here today is transgender. We all grew up in a society in which transphobia is institutionalized and taught from birth as correct. And that unless you are transgender, whether you like it or not, transphobia occurs to your direct benefit. So I ask you today to search yourselves and fight any transphobia you may find within yourself, no matter how subtle. Woo! As transgender people, even we must fight our own internalized transphobia that sometimes keeps us from claiming our full rights to human dignity and equality, and which keeps us from fighting transphobia even within ourselves. As long as we can be discriminated against for being transgender, you will always maintain the upper hand against anyone within your own demographic who is transgender. And if that statement of fact causes you discomfort, I say all the better, because it shows that while you may always benefit from cis privilege, it makes it clear that you do not wish to remain complicit in the oppression of your transgender sisters and brothers and non-binary siblings. And I call you to acknowledge, evaluate, and challenge your privilege as a cis person, not as a call to shame, but rather as a call to greatness. It means that you have power that you can use to benefit those who do not, and it is a call to use that power to serve that good and noble purpose, as you are doing right now by being here in support of trans people today.
Yeah! Woo!
But society does not recognize us as human. In pop culture, we are the butt of sitcom jokes or a novelty. In reality, we are dying in the streets at a rate which could only accurately be referred to as genocide. And I'm not only referring to the recent massacre in Orlando, which still weighs heavily on my heart. I'm also referring to the at least 23 trans people who are known to have been murdered within our own borders last year, the hundreds more who were murdered worldwide, the 14 who have been murdered within our own borders so far this year, the many more who will be murdered before the close of the year, the countless more whose deaths will be ignored, erased, or glossed over entirely for the sake of preserving our complacency, and the similar numbers who are murdered every year specifically for being transgender. This is an epidemic of violence which many cisgender people who are not trans, remain unaware of, or perhaps more accurately remain simply unmoved by. In a society where our lives and our deaths, especially those of Black and Latinx trans people, simply do not seem to be valued or worth protection. The proof is in the fact that this restroom debate is even a debate in the first place, when there has never been a reliably reported case of any trans person assaulting, harassing, or peeping on anyone in any restroom ever. Meanwhile, numbers from GLAAD and the National Center for Transgender Equality put the odds of being murdered as a transgender woman in 1 in 12. And a study from the Williams Institute has revealed that over 70% of transgender people have faced discrimination, harassment, or physical violence attempting to use a public restroom. 54% have developed health complications on account of taking desperate measures to avoid public restrooms altogether. And nearly all transgender people have faced or will face physical violence or sexual assault at least once, if not many times in our lives, only to have these incidents ignored and justified. The very real violence against us simply isn't as much of an issue in society's eyes as an imagined threat. And I will state again that there has never, not once, been a reliably reported or confirmed case of any trans person assaulting or harassing or peeping on anyone in any restroom, and yet we are apparently the menace society needs protection from. I am transgender. This is my life. In every case, the story used to justify violence against us is either a complete fabrication or a case of an assault carried out by a cis man who did not present or identify himself as female at any point, and who would still be unable to lawfully enter a restroom. To carry out such a crime against anyone, even with protections in place for transgender women, because laws allowing the use of women's restrooms by transgender women do not allow the use of restrooms by cisgender men, and because laws protecting trans women's right to use the women's restroom in safety also do not legalize harassment, rape, or assault, which are all illegal and will remain illegal. And people who carry out illegal rights do not need an excuse to do so. They will do them anyway. These arguments ignore the fact that men have never bothered to disguise themselves to enter women's restrooms. They ignore the young male victims and survivors of sexual assault, which have occurred at the hands of men in men's restrooms. They ignore the fact that transgender men exist and face violence using the women's restrooms they are forced to use under anti-trans bathroom laws. They ignore the fact that non-binary people have no restroom to use in a world of men's and women's restrooms. And most importantly, they ignore the fact that all transgender people face a disproportionate degree of violence simply for daring to exist in a society which, much as these KKK flyers, labels us as an abomination and tells us to use a tree in the backyard. Ooh. And I believe we all know which tree they are referring to. It's the same tree the Klansmen have hung our Black brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings from for well over a century. It is the vile, twisted tree of white supremacy, misogyny, homophobia, religious fundamentalism, and transphobia that the KKK roots itself in. And make no mistake, I do not mean to or wish to conflate or compare the oppression we face as trans people with the racial oppression people of color, especially our Black brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings, have faced for hundreds of years and still face today. For even as a person of color, I am still not Black. I am a Latina of Apache descent, and so I will never truly understand the oppression Black people face. Just as people who are Black will also never truly understand the oppression of Native and Latinx people. And no cis person, regardless of race, will ever truly understand the oppression trans people face. This is not to say that any marginalized group's oppression is any worse than any others. This is not a competition to be the most oppressed. Being oppressed is always an unimaginably unbearable burden for the oppressed, regardless of the institutional biases and hatreds which give birth to and feed and shape that oppression. My intent is not to determine who is more oppressed than whom, but to recognize that the oppressions that marginalized communities face are inherently different, because they are rooted in biases and hatreds which are inherently different, and therefore cannot be compared or placed into competition with one another. And yet so often, this is what I see happening. White people embrace racism without regard to gender orientation. Men embrace misogyny without regard to orientation or race. Straight people embrace homophobia without regard to race or gender. Those with class and wealth privilege live extravagantly at the expense of the rest of us without any regard for any of it. And cis people embrace transphobia without regard to race, gender, or even orientation. And none of us can afford to promote or tolerate it any longer. Because while the oppressions we face are vastly different, they do intersect. I stand before you as proof simply by being a pansexual transgender woman of color. And yet we continue to persecute our own. When cis people of color persecute their trans brethren, and when white trans people persecute their brethren of color, when misogynoir is allowed to happen even within feminist movements, and when gay bashing takes place within marginalized communities, and when trans exclusionary radicals, who will never truly be feminists, speak against trans women, we are marginalizing our own just as the over-encompassing patriarchy wants us to. Because divided, we are not a threat to their privilege and supremacy. No one who contributes to that hierarchy is in any way capable of liberating anyone, not even themselves. And while the oppressions we face are vastly different, our enemy is the same. The white supremacist, cis-heteronormative fundamentalist patriarchy, which the KKK serves as the very embodiment of. And my fight against hierarchy is my sister's fight and my brother's fight and my non-binary siblings' fight, regardless of their individual battles, and regardless of their race, sex, gender, religion, class, or orientation, because I will never be free until they are all free.
Yeah. Woo! Woo!
And neither will any of the rest of us, which is why I marched down Palafox Street in Pensacola 2 years ago in silent but visible solidarity alongside my black brethren as a reminder to the world that Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And why I have advocated for and will always advocate for the reproductive rights of uterus owners, be they women, men, or non-binary, in spite of the fact that I will never have one, and which is why I will continue to fight as an intersectional feminist for the liberties and social justice of all who face discrimination and marginalization for any unjust reason.
Yeah.
Those who embody hatred, like the KKK, talk of protecting women and children, while failing to recognize that trans women are women and trans children are children, and that we face a very real threat of violence which is not imagined or rooted in biased myths, and that we cannot protect women or children while marginalizing trans women or trans children, any more than I can liberate my trans sisters without liberating my black trans sisters. None of us are free until we are all free, and none of us are free as long as we allow a domestic terrorist organization like the KKK to continue to even exist, much less thrive in a nation which claims to be built on the foundations of justice and equality. Justice and equality which will never become a reality in the face of transphobic and homophobic violence, which we did not win victory over with the establishment of marriage equality. Last weekend's massacre in Orlando was a stark and grim reminder of the fact, at the cost of so many brave, beautiful, and loving queer, trans, and Latinx lives, which we will never be able to get back. And do not be fooled by the Islamophobic media who seek to encourage violence against an oft-maligned and marginalized religion and culture with one hand, At the same time, they seek to erase the importance and value of trans and queer lives with the other hand. This was not an attack rooted in anyone's Islamic faith, but a fear of those who are different, which is a fear we've been cultivating right here in America since the very beginning of white colonialism. It may not always be recognized as such, but terrorism is now, and has always been right here in our own backyard, practiced just as often at the hands of white individuals and white supremacist groups like the KKK as they are by any other demographic, and often justified as freedom of speech. And as always, they seek to rely on us to play into their hands, and so often we do just that by using our own oppressions as a bludgeon to beat other marginalized groups we still hold privilege over back into silence, in hopes that the patriarchy will eventually give us what we desire, but that will never happen. Instead, we will invariably find ourselves crippled by having beaten down so many of our own. Patriarchy knows that we are only minorities when taken separately, and that if we all banded together to liberate everyone who is oppressed, they would quickly find themselves massively overwhelmed. But that will not happen until we learn to become truly intersectional. And do not be fooled, this message from the KKK about trans people is not a matter of protecting anyone, and it is not a matter of free speech. It is a matter of hatred. One cannot claim not to hate trans people without granting us all of the same liberties and protections to which cis people are already entitled at birth simply by not being trans. Anything less is rooted in transphobia, no matter how subtle it may be. We are brought to think of true equality as being a step too far, or in most cases many steps too far. We are brought to ask, what more do you people want?
Come on.
While still denying marginalized people the right to even exist, much less have justice. And we must learn to challenge those biases, no matter what they are.
Yeah. Woo! Come on.
I know I myself have had to grow and learn to challenge those I was taught, many of which I even internalized against myself. And I still have to challenge them each and every day, just as every single one of us always will. Dr. Huey P. Newton himself, the founder of the Black Panthers and a relentless advocate for social justice, once wrote his own message on the subject of learning to overcome homophobia, misogyny, and transphobia in a speech regarding the importance of intersectionality and specifically the liberation of women and LGBT people, which he delivered on August 15th of 1970, in which he states that maybe a homosexual could be the most revolutionary.
Woo!
And while his language states itself by lumping all trans and queer people together, it is clear that his message was nothing if not revolutionary, and that it was a call not only to accept or tolerate those of us who are LGBT, but to embrace and to recognize the great potential we have to help bring about the change we all seek. Perhaps this is why so many trans women of color, all the way from Marsha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, to those of us who still follow in the footsteps they left behind at Stonewall on June 28, 1969 to this day, feel called upon so often to champion social justice. And it is my hope that Dr. Newton's words will come to be fulfilled, and that banding together for the liberation of trans people of all races, genders, and orientations, we may truly come to the liberation of all. Perhaps it is fitting, as transphobia has always been inextricably tied into racism by the Western gender binary, which has always required the violent oppression and suppression of cultural gender constructs of people of color, especially those of Native American, Asian, and Polynesian people, in order to exist even to this very day. It has been just as inextricably tied to misogynist ideas, which say that to be a woman or even anything like a woman is the worst thing a penis owner could ever be. As well as to the homophobia, which also takes roots in misogyny and which dictates that even love itself is an abomination when it exists between two people of the same sex or gender. So perhaps as we begin to fight transphobia, it will be that together we can all band together to dismantle every oppressive institution which continues to hold so many of us down and claim so many of our lives.
Woo! Woo!
We must all remember that divisions are diversions and that unity, solidarity, and caring for one another, even when we may not understand each other's struggles, will be our only keys to victory. As for the KKK, and all other ignorant and hateful people who wish to exterminate trans people, my people, allow me to enlighten that ignorance by reminding you that we have always been here, we are still here, and we will always be here.
Yeah.
White colonialism couldn't exterminate us when you fed my two-spirit ancestors to your dogs for our refusal to conform to your white Western gender binary. Modern America couldn't exterminate trans women of color at Stonewall in 1969. And even if you kill me and all of my sisters and brothers and non-binary siblings, you will never exterminate us.
Yes.
We will continue to be born this way, just as we have always been, and just as we always will be.
Woo!
Violence is the last act of a desperate man. In this case, that of white, straight, cis men, desperate to preserve their privilege and their power over all the rest of us to live in extravagance at our expense. But I say to you once again, we are here, we have always been here, and I will fight to my last breath for our rights to safety and equality and justice, because we are never, ever going anywhere. And it is long past time that those in power put an end to the fact that we continue to allow a domestic terrorist organization like the KKK to be characterized as free speech, or even to exist in any form whatsoever, once and for all.
Yeah!
Hey everyone, thanks again so much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that like button and share so that your friends can enjoy it too. And be sure to subscribe, because there's more where that came from, including activism and awareness videos, tutorials, you can follow my transition, and even check out some of my music. I also want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters, because y'all are what make this channel possible. Thank you. If you're not a patron yet and you want to find out how you can get awesome rewards like autographed pictures from my modeling shoots and more for your support, just go to www.patreon.com/DeliaMelody to find out how you can sign up today. And be sure to check out Designs by Delia on Redbubble for all your official Delia Melody swag needs. See you next time, and be yourself.